In ages long past, back before we only had x86 CPUs to look forward to, there was a platform called the Amiga. The Commodore Amiga. A platform with hardware and capabilities way beyond what the average user of the PC or the home computer from that age had the courage to even dream of. And it could do games like nobody's business. Games that looked really good. Or really well, I'm not sure which is the correct form anymore. And there were people that knew this, that understood that this platform offered something that nothing else could. So they banded together and formed a company called Cinemaware, created with the objective of giving people interactive movies. But not interactive movies as we may consider them today, where you're looking at a movie and at one point or another you can make a choice. This wasn't Dragon's Lair. This wasn't Late Shift, which is a quite recent interactive movie released both on Steam and in cinemas to let people vote on what happens in the movie. And it wasn't the quotes the size of Jupiter interactive kind of experience that you would get with something like Dear Esther. No. Even though Cinemaware dubbed its creations interactive movies, they were video games. And the first one of them all was Defender of the Crown, a game that is absolutely inspired by movie. It is meant to give you the same experience of swashbuckling majesty and adventure and greatness that you used to see in the old Hollywood movies from yonder years. Something kind of exemplified by the cover and the poster of the movie that, well, let's say they wouldn't fly today. No, they would still totally fly, but it would just make some people upset, and I get why. But it harkens back to an older era. Now, you may say that this in itself as a representation of that era is problematic, and that wouldn't be wrong, but still, you understood what they wanted to do and why. It was about evoking a style, an age, not about sexism. And speaking of style, this game could afford it. The graphics were made by James D. Sachs. I think that's how we pronounce his name. You may know him as the guy that made that fish tank screensaver that was everywhere like 30 years ago. And he was kind of a master at pixel art. And the Amiga, by coincidence, had some really good pixel art software on it, like Deluxe Paint. And that enabled him to create the graphics, the scenes, the pretty much everything you saw in this game at a level that, how should I put this? This game was released in 1986. This is Sid Meier's Pirates, released on the PC in 1987. They are absolutely comparable because at their core, they are both games that aim to give you the experience of a certain style, usually influenced by movies, but adventure, and they are made up primarily of minigames. Look at the differences. Now sure, you can argue that Defender of the Crown had fewer things to actually put on screen. You didn't travel across a very large and detailed map, but then again, the map of Sid Meier's Pirates looked like bunk. And they would go on to make a sort of sea-themed game as well with the Adventures of Sinbad. However, they didn't do what I would have hoped they would have done, and that is a proper Pirates game. Because imagine having a Pirates game with those graphics back then. That's a level of detail that we sort of got with Pirates Gold about 7 years later. So back to Defender of the Crown. It was inspired by ye old Hollywood movies and by the romantic history, shall we put it, of Britain, as told through the story of Ivanhoe. It was the Middle Ages, the 12th century. The king was dead, and all the lords have decided that today is the day when we will decide who shall be the next king to battle. And so lines were formed between the Saxons and the Normans, and you as a Saxon would have to band together with your Saxon brethren, or not, you could totally stab it in the back, and defeat the Normans and conquer the land, rescue the maidens held in a castle, probably eventually marry one of them. There was like a scene with a see-through nightie illuminated by a fireplace with the silhouette, and like I said, the game had graphics for 1986 that will just blow your mind. If you're from 1986, you would have sieges to go to, you would have jousts to participate in, and you would have glory and combat. And it looked superb. It all looked wonderful, amazing. Kind of crap at being a game. Now, the actual territory control thing, where you recruit your armies, where you gain troops, you gain money from the land you have, then you switch around with other people because you may lose them. it's a nice territory control game. There's nothing really all that outstanding about it. But then again, this was 1986, which still that isn't saying much because that's a year after Ultima 4, one of the best games ever made, at least back then. So that territory control bit where you run around the map, raiding castles, fighting against opposing armies, collecting troops, getting knights, soldiers, catapults, building castles for defense. That's all nice. You can even go to Sherwood Forest and recruit the help of Robin Hood, Robin of Locksley, depicted as Errol Flynnish as you've ever seen him. You could only do it 3 times, he would not help you further. But the rest of the game is a collection of very quick and very vague minigames. The jousting one requires you to aim your lance, you're bobbing up and down the lance at the center of a shield of your opponent. You're not exactly ever sure where you're actually gonna hit because it keeps bobbing up and down and up and down. I think when it's at its highest point, that's where the impact will be, but you have so little time to actually get it properly focused and so little feedback about where technically it's supposed to go that it usually ends in failure. Though if you select a character that is good at jousting, you will have more success. You'll have a bigger tolerance for failure. And in jousting, you can either do it for fame, which I forgot what it actually meant, or you could do it for land and kind of sort of peacefully take the world over if you have enough money to host a tourney every round, because it's a turn-based game, or if somebody else hosts the tourney. Then there was the sword fighting minigame. I have no clue how it works, I just know that I have to mash click because the Amiga had a mouse until the enemy dies or I die. There's no point to it. The sword combat in Sid Meier's Pirates, which was not as visually pleasing, was kind of better. Though there is one thing, when you step into the tower or the castle, the place you're raiding, there is an amazing piece of cinematography, if you will, where you see your character approaching through the door and behind him you see the shadow, and that is straight out of the Errol Flynn Robin Hood movies because I know that scene, I've seen it. It's a superb nod to the original source material in the style of it. That portion of the game is total bunk, but that's a whole other matter. You also have the catapult minigame, which you have to divine exactly what the game wants you to hit and how. It's sort of pixel perfect accuracy that requires you to hit a wall, not knowing exactly where things are gonna actually hit. There's no feedback in any of these, absolutely no feedback. In the Amiga version, you have nothing to guide you. It's going by your guts repeatedly, failing and failing and failing and failing until eventually you will either figure out what you have to do or quit the game. Now sure, back in those days when games could be a bit more obtuse because you didn't have where to put stuff in them to explain stuff, people were a bit more lenient than they are today, unless it's Dark Souls, in which case they'll appraise obtuseness until there's no tomorrow. But when the game was ported to other platforms, it did get a couple of refinements like life bars, so you know at least what energy you have left when you're dueling somebody. And instead of having to manually go to Sherwood Forest to talk to Robin Hood, you can ask him from the menu. They even added in the DOS version the option to pass your turn in case you didn't want to do anything. But then again, in the DOS version, if you recruit an army, that it constitutes a turn unto itself. There are some notable differences between the original Amiga version and its numerous many ports, and some of them can be chalked up to the fact that the Fender of the Crown had some content that was cut out of it, stuff that never made it into the original version. Patching wasn't still a thing back then, sort of, but some of the ports did get some of the other features eventually. Still, in spite of the cut content, that didn't stop the game from selling around 20,000 units in '86, which may not sound like a lot, but back then it was something. And apparently by the end of 2001, in all its iterations, it sold around 1 million copies. And it was probably pirated to hell and back, because of course it was. Why would it not be? This was the crisis of its time, if you will. It was the graphics benchmark if you had an Amiga. And it would run the same on any Amiga because all the Amigas were kind of the same. Well, the 500 was a cut down version of the 1000, but still, it ran on everything. It was meant to. The Fender of the Crown is not what you would call a great game. That is a collection of somewhat slightly vague and not all that satisfying minigames, but put together, It's an interesting adventure. It puts a lot of emphasis on style, and it pulls off that style a lot better than it does pretty much everything else. Its ports would refine the game, they would add more options to your attacks, your tactics, but most of them would not really have graphics that were that well made. Because again, the Amiga could do the do. It even had remakes, like a super complete total remake for the PlayStation 2. It was called Robin Hood Defender of the Crown. And Cinemaware would go on to create a bunch of other similar games like the Sinbad one I said before and the King of Chicago and a bunch of whole other titles up until, well, the Amiga went belly up and he started making sports games, or at least were bought by someone that made sports games. I wouldn't say it's one of the best games ever made, but it is memorable and it is very evocative of the age it was built in. And if you want to try it, you can absolutely find it on GOG right now for the price of €5.20. It actually comes with two versions that you can choose between, either the PC DOS version or the Amiga one, which is emulated with kind of mouse support right from the get-go. You can see the wonder of the Amiga on a PC, and then wonder how something that looks so beautiful, that would kind of be unmatched in terms of visuals up until, well, I guess 92 or 93, could be kind of so shallow in terms of gameplay. And then you realize, wait a minute, modern games do the same thing and they're even worse at it. And then you'll laugh. Goodbye.